Imagine for a second, right, that you are applying to be the CEO of this massive, incredibly powerful, highly regulated corporation.
Okay, I'm picturing it.
You walk into the boardroom, and the rules of this corporation, which were, etched in stone by the legendary founder who just passed away, they strictly state that the new CEO absolutely must hold a specific, highly advanced PhD.
Right, no exceptions.
Exactly, zero exceptions. But you walk in, and you only have a master's degree. Now, in a normal world, your resume just gets tossed in the trash.
Oh,
right?
absolutely. They'd laugh you out of the room.
Yeah, but in this scenario, the board of directors looks at you and they realize they desperately need a loyalist, to keep the company from fracturing.
Yeah.
So they hire you anyway.
Wow.
And to make it legal, they literally rewrite the corporate bylaws overnight and print you a shiny new diploma.
I mean, that sounds like an absurd corporate scandal, right? Like the kind of thing that would instantly trigger a shareholder revolt and just collapse the stock price.
It really does. It shouldn't work at all. But if you take that exact scenario out of the boardroom and you drop it into the world of modern geopolitics, you are looking at the foundational moment of the current era of the Islamic Republic of Iran.
Right, which is exactly what we're getting into today.
Yes, so welcome to this deep dive. If you're joining us right now, you've asked us to unpack a truly fascinating body of academic research, specifically diving into the geopolitical history mapped out in the work Islamic Order under Khamenei.
And our mission for you today, what we really want to get into, is dissecting this massive, almost paradoxical question that political scientists have been debating for decades.
It's a huge question.
It is. The question is basically this. How did a strict theocratic system, a system explicitly and, entirely designed around the unique, singular, almost gravitational charisma of its founder, Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini, how did it manage to not only survive his death, but actually adapt and entrench itself for decades?
Because when Khomeini passed away in 1989, the entire center of gravity for that nation it vanished overnight.
Right? Poof, gone.
The whole architecture of the state was built for a specific man who simply wasn't there anymore. So what we are going to explore with you today is, honestly, the ultimate political balancing act.
It really is a high-wire act.
Yeah. We're going to examine how a new supreme leader acted as this unyielding conservative anchor at the very top of the system, while beneath him, managing the actual day-to-day governance, 4 radically different presidents took power.
And they were vastly different, right?
Completely.
Yeah.
We're talking about a pragmatic deal maker, an idealistic reformist, a combative populist, and then a cautious moderate. The political pendulum of the country swung wildly back and forth between these 4 men, and yet somehow the system held.
And to really understand how the system tolerates that kind of extreme internal swinging without just fracturing completely, we need to introduce you to the core operating system of this government.
Oh, I love this part. This is key.
Yeah, the analytical framework we're looking at identifies this as the jihadi-ijtihadi duality. It's essentially the ideological elasticity built directly into the DNA of the Islamic Republic.
I really want to spend some time on this because it feels like the master key to literally everything we're going to talk about today.
Mm-hmm.
Can you break down those 2 terms for us? Like, how does this duality actually function in practice?
Yeah, sure. It's a brilliant conceptual framework, honestly. Think of it as a constant, ongoing negotiation between 2 opposing forces.
Okay.
So the jihadi aspect, and we're using this strictly in the context of revolutionary struggle and steadfastness here, it represents the hardline, uncompromising conservative principles of the 1979 revolution.
So it's the ideological bedrock.
Exactly. It is the absolute commitment to a theocratic order, the deep suspicion of foreign influence, and the strict adherence to traditionalist religious values. It's the inflexible core.
Right, the non-negotiables, the things the state will absolutely go to war over to protect.
Precisely. But here's the catch, right? A modern nation-state cannot survive on pure, unyielding ideology alone.
Right, because you still have to, pave roads and manage inflation.
Yes. You have to conduct international trade, deal with changing demographics, all of that. And that is where the ijtihadi aspect comes in.
Okay, so what does that mean exactly?
Well, in Islamic jurisprudence, ijtihad refers to the process of independent reasoning or interpretation. So in this specific political context, it represents pragmatic, adaptable, flexible governance.
Got it. So it's the bending of the rules.
Exactly. It's the system's ability to bend the rules, to reinterpret dogma, to basically make the really uncomfortable compromises required to actually govern an 80 million person country in a globalized world.
So the system is just constantly oscillating.
Yeah.
It's this crazy tension between the inflexible sacred rules and the messy, adaptable reality of running a state.
Yeah, that tension is everything.
And the man who mastered this oscillation, the guy who took over after Khomeini and used this exact framework to keep this system alive when, honestly, every Western analyst thought it might just collapse, that's Ayatollah Ali Khamenei.
Which means we really need to start our historical analysis by looking closely at Khamenei himself, because his ascension to the role of supreme leader is, historically speaking, highly improbable.
Improbable is almost an understatement.
Right. Before we even get to the presidents who served under his watch, you just have to understand the sheer tactical brilliance it took for Khamenei to even secure his own position.
Right. Let's get into his background. Looking at the biographical data provided in our research, Khamenei was born in 1939 in the city of Mashhad. He's of Azeri heritage, and he carries the title of Sayyid, which is a highly respected honorific, right? It denotes a direct bloodline descendant of the Prophet Muhammad.
Yes, that's a very significant title.
And he was a passionate revolutionary from the very early days. The research shows he even translated works by Sayyid Qutb, the prominent Egyptian Sunni Islamist, which really shows he was thinking about broad, pan-Islamic revolutionary ideas long before the Shah ever fell.
Oh, yeah. He had impeccable revolutionary credentials. I mean, he spent time in the Shah's prisons in 1963 for his anti-monarchy activities.
A real true believer.
Absolutely. He was a fiercely loyal disciple of Khomeini, and he actually served as the president of Iran during the incredibly grueling, devastating Iran-Iraq War in the 1980s.
So he definitely had the resume of a revolutionary survivor. But here is the massive constitutional roadblock that brings us back to that corporate CEO analogy we started with.
Right, the Mitzvah PhD.
Exactly. The Constitution of the Islamic Republic at the time explicitly demanded that the supreme leader, like the absolute highest authority in the land, must be a marja.
And that is a critical term to define for you. A marja, or a marja taqlid, translates to a source of emulation.
So it's not just a political title.
Not at all. This is not a title you get just by being a savvy politician. It is the absolute highest rank of religious authority in 12er Shia Islam.
Wow.
It requires decades of exhaustive, rigorous study in the seminaries. A marja is a grand ayatollah whose theological knowledge is so profound that millions of followers literally base their daily religious practice on his specific rulings.
So Khomeini was a marja.
Yes, Ayatollah Khomeini was a marja. He had that unquestionable, transcendent religious authority.
But Khomeini was not a marja. He wasn't even an ayatollah at the time Khomeini died.
No, he wasn't.
The historical records confirm he only held the middle-ranking clerical title of Hojjat ul-Islam, which basically just means authority on Islam.
Right.
I mean, it's a respected rank, certainly.
Yeah.
But it is leagues away from the theological stratosphere required to be the supreme leader.
And the documentation shows that almost none of his senior clerical peers seriously expected him to inherit the top position.
Because his religious qualifications simply didn't meet the constitutional threshold.
Exactly. Even Khamenei himself was acutely aware of this deficit. He didn't originally campaign to be the sole autocrat, you know? He actually advocated for the creation of a collective leadership council to replace Khomeini.
Because he knew he didn't have the theological weight to stand alone.
Right.
But the political power brokers of the time, specifically the Speaker of the Parliament, Akbar Hashemi Rafsanjani, who we are going to talk about extensively in just a few minutes, they realized that a leadership council would be weak and fractured.
They needed a single, decisive figurehead. They needed Khamenei.
So they pushed him through the assembly of experts, they secured the majority vote, and then they executed that unbelievable retroactive maneuver.
They elevated his clerical rank by political intercession.
Which is wild.
It is. The title of Ayatollah was essentially bestowed upon him post-election to retroactively satisfy the eligibility requirements. And that was followed by swift amendments to the Constitution itself to literally lower the theological requirements for the supreme leader.
So he was granted the rank not by, like, the traditional grueling years of seminary consensus, but just by the urgent, pragmatic needs of state survival.
Yes.
I mean, this is the ultimate ijtihadi moment. They completely compromised the strict religious rules to ensure the political survival of the system.
They absolutely did.
But you can imagine how this played with the old guard. He's stepping into this bespoke, heavy, tailored suit made perfectly for the charismatic, godlike Khomeini, and he has to somehow tailor it to fit his own frame from the inside out.
While all of the senior clerics are just watching him.
Exactly. And a lot of those senior ayatollahs were furious.
Uh.
The texts show they completely disdained his promotion.
Oh, his legitimacy was incredibly tenuous in those early months. He just lacked Khomeini's natural charisma. He couldn't just issue a decree and expect the entire nation to fall to their knees in spiritual obedience.
Right, so what does he do?
Well, what the analysis highlights is Khamenei's defining characteristic, his unparalleled shrewdness as a tactician. He realized that if he couldn't command power through divine charisma, he would manufacture it through brilliant, granular, relentless institutional maneuvering.
And the consolidation playbook he ran is breathtaking in its speed.
Yeah.
I mean, the historical data points out that within 48 hours of Khomeini's death, just 2 days, Khamenei was already dispatching his personal representatives out to the various provinces across Iran.
Right, he's not just sitting in Tehran mourning.
No. He is actively securing the perimeter. He's sending goodwill notes. He's locking down the loyalty of regional Friday prayer leaders. He is ensuring that the massive, sprawling religious infrastructure of the country answers directly to him.
It was a masterclass in preemptive power building. He did not wait for his theological authority to be questioned. He operated as though his political authority was absolute from the very first second.
Because he knew his religious credentials were weak compared to the grand ayatollahs in the seminaries of Qum, right?
Exactly. So he actively engaged like-minded hardline clerics who shared his traditionalist worldview. He brought them into his inner circle, effectively surrounding himself with this ideological Praetorian Guard.
He systematically packed the state apparatus. He made sure loyalists controlled the judiciary, the state media, and the vast network of religious organizations.
But crucially, his background during the war gave him an angle that the traditional clerics didn't have.
Right, because he was a former deputy defense minister. He knew the military.
And that was his true ace in the hole. He recognized that ultimate power in a volatile region rests on a monopoly of force. So he bypassed the traditional regular army and cemented incredibly tight, unbreakable alliances with the ISEPA, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, or IRGC.
And their massive volunteer militia, the Basij.
Yes. He made sure the commanders of these forces knew that their massive budgets, their prestige, and their power had flowed directly from his office, not from the elected parliament.
Wow. And we can't forget the bonyads either.
Oh, right, the bonyads.
These are the massive, powerful state foundations. Just to give you a sense of scale, if you're listening, these aren't just little local charities.
Not at all.
After the 1979 revolution, the state seized the immense, multi-billion-dollar industrial and real estate assets of the fleeing Shah and his elite. They bundled these assets into these foundations, ostensibly to, help the poor and veterans.
Right, that was the official narrative.
But in reality, they operate as these gargantuan, tax-exempt shadow economies that account for a massive percentage of Iran's GDP. And who do the directors of these bonyads answer to?
Only the Supreme Leader.
Only the Supreme Leader. It's wild.
By weaving himself so deeply into the military, the intelligence apparatus, and the untaxable economic engines of the country, Khamenei essentially built a fortress.
And to formalize this web of influence, he established an institution called Beiti Rabari, the House of Leadership.
Yes, the academic literature often compares this structure to the old Shah's royal court. It functions as a centralized, highly efficient, parallel government that operates entirely above and outside the formal elected government.
It is the true center of gravity in the country. So what does this deep dive into Khamenei's consolidation of power mean for you as you're listening to this?
It's the context for everything that follows.
Exactly. It means that as we transition into looking at the actual elected politicians, the presidents whose names make the global headlines, you have to hold this reality in your mind. The Supreme Leader had completely secured the unelected tier of the state. His fortress was impenetrable.
But he couldn't manage every single pothole, trade deal, and economic crisis himself.
Right. He had to allow the elected tier to govern. And that brings us to the first major swing of the political pendulum under his watch.
Yes, we enter the era of the pragmatist. Akbar Hashemi Rafsanjani, who served as president from 1989 to 1997.
Now, Rafsanjani is a fascinating study in contradictions. He is a cleric, yes, but if you look at his biographical profile in the research, he operates much more like a seasoned corporate titan.
Very true.
He was born in 1934 into a very wealthy family of pistachio growers in the Kerman province. The sources describe him as deeply business-minded, charismatic, highly eloquent, and a pragmatic deal-maker to his absolute core.
And crucially, he and Khamenei were exceptionally close. They had been friends and political allies since the 1950s. They survived the revolution together.
Right, and as we discussed, Rafsanjani was the primary architect who actually engineered Khamenei's elevation to the role of supreme leader.
He was. But philosophically, their worldviews began to diverge significantly the moment they assumed their respective offices.
How so?
Well, Khamenei viewed the world through the strict conservative ideological lens of the jihadi framework, but Rafsanjani viewed the world through the practical ijtihadi lens of a builder.
Which makes sense, because you have to understand the reality on the ground in Iran in 1989. The country had just emerged from an 8-year trench warfare bloodbath with Saddam Hussein's Iraq.
We are talking about hundreds of thousands of casualties.
Yeah. The infrastructure was decimated. The economy was heavily centralized, heavily rationed, and just completely exhausted. Rafsanjani looked at this devastated landscape and realized that if the Islamic Republic didn't generate some actual wealth, the whole project would just collapse under its own poverty.
He understood that ideological purity does not put food on the table or rebuild bombed-out oil refineries.
Right.
So he initiated a massive mission of post-war reconstruction and economic liberalization. He pushed aggressively for a transition toward a market economy.
He wanted to dismantle the wartime rationing system, right?
Yes, and he initiated the creation of free economic zones, like the one on Kish Island in the Persian Gulf, specifically designed to bypass the clunky domestic bureaucracy and attract foreign investment and technology.
He was essentially trying to do for Iran what Deng Xiaoping did for China. Keep this strict political monopoly, but open up the economic engine to the world.
That's a great comparison.
And he knew that to attract investment, he had to change Iran's terrifying international image. So he launches a very calculated foreign policy charm offensive.
And the geopolitical maneuvering here is highly instructive.
Right.
The research details how Rafsanjani actively sought to repair relations with Saudi Arabia, a major regional rival.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. He traveled there to personally reassure the Saudi monarchy that Iran was shifting its focus inward toward rebuilding and was no longer actively trying to violently export its Islamic revolution across the Persian Gulf.
That's a huge pivot.
Massive.
Yeah.
And he aggressively boosted trade delegations with Russia, India, and China, looking for partners who cared more about commerce than ideology.
He even tried to quietly de-escalate tensions with the West. The historical record shows his administration deliberately downplayed the state's role in the fatwa, the religious decree calling for the death of the British Indian author Salman Rushdie, which had caused a massive rupture with European nations.
Right.
Furthermore, Rafsanjani utilized back-channel Iranian influence over Shia militias in Lebanon to help secure the release of Western hostages. He was flashing a giant neon sign to the global community saying, hey, we're open for business. We could be a rational, functioning nation-state.
But this is precisely where the pendulum swings too far for the conservative establishment.
Here we go.
Rafsanjani hits a solid, unyielding wall of jihadi resistance. The hardliners, the very clerics and military commanders who had just helped Khamenei secure his fortress, were horrified by Rafsanjani's pragmatism.
Because they didn't view capitalism as a tool for rebuilding, right?
Not at all. They viewed it as a corrosive asset that would eat away the spiritual purity of the revolution.
They genuinely believed that economic liberalization was just a Trojan horse for Western cultural imperialism. There is an incredible, revealing quote in the research from a hardline conservative publication from that era called Meshrek.
Oh, yes. This is a crucial quote.
It perfectly encapsulates their mindset. They wrote, and I quote, "Democracy is nothing but the dictatorship of capital, consumerism, and selfishness. Democracy is reactionary. It is a return to paganism and disbelief." End quote.
It's a stunning piece of rhetoric.
It really is.
They're literally equating modern economic and democratic openness with jahiliyyah, the pre-Islamic state of ignorance and paganism. To the conservative mind, Rafsanjani wasn't just making bad economic policy, he was actively endangering the soul of the nation.
And unfortunately for Rafsanjani, the actual execution of his economic reforms handed his conservative critics all the ammunition they needed.
Because of the corruption.
Exactly. When you take a highly centralized, opaque post-war economy and suddenly start privatizing state assets without strong, independent legal oversight, what happens? Rampant, eye-watering corruption.
The privatization process became an absolute feeding frenzy for the well-connected. This era gave rise to a phenomenon documented in the text as the Agazada.
What does that mean?
It translates to the offspring of men of means and influence. Essentially, The children of the revolutionary elite leveraged their family names to secure incredibly lucrative state contracts, import licenses, and monopolies within those new free economic zones.
So it was the birth of an oligarchic class disguised as pious revolutionaries.
Oh, exactly.
And those bonyads we talked about earlier, they became the absolute emblems of this elite corruption.
Oh, absolutely.
Because they were tax-exempt and answered only to the Supreme Leader, they just swallowed up privatized industries with zero public accountability. The research notes that a formal parliamentary investigation eventually found the largest of these bonyads guilty of massive influence peddling and financial irregularities.
And the taint of this corruption reached the absolute highest levels of the executive branch. It reached right into Rafsanjani's own family.
Wait, really?
Yes. The historical documentation points out that two of his sons were deeply implicated in major corruption scandals. One involved a multi-billion-dollar development contract for the Tehran metro system, and another son was handed a highly prominent and lucrative position within the state oil ministry.
Oof. The optics for a system built on the promise of social justice were catastrophic.
Truly catastrophic.
Okay, looking at all this data, a massive structural question emerges for me. I have to push back on the mechanics of this relationship a bit.
Okay, go ahead.
We've established that Rafsanjani is the guy who basically handed Khamenei the Supreme Leader job on a silver platter. They've been brothers in arms since the 1950s. If Khamenei has absolute power, why didn't he step in and protect his friend?
It's a great question.
Why did Khamenei allow the hardline clerics in the media to just tear Rafsanjani's policies apart?
That is the essential question of Khamenei's leadership style, and the analysis provides a brilliant dissection of his strategy. It wasn't about what Khamenei actively did to stop Rafsanjani, it was about what he didn't do.
Okay, what do you mean?
Khamenei weaponized his own silence. He maintained a highly strategic, calculating distance from the president's domestic battles.
The power of silent consent.
Exactly. You have to remember Khamenei's own convictions were deeply conservative, and his entire power base relied on the traditionalist clerics and the IRGC. He knew that his public silence would be interpreted by the hardliners as a green light to attack.
Wow.
Khamenei was playing a brilliant, ruthless game of jihadi-ijtihadi balance. He needed Rafsanjani's pragmatic business acumen to rebuild the country's shattered infrastructure, but he absolutely could not allow Rafsanjani to dilute the ideological core of the state.
So he uses his friend's pragmatic skills to fix the plumbing and wire the electricity, but he lets his conservative guard dogs loose to make sure his friend doesn't try to change the locks on the front door.
That is the perfect analogy. It is incredibly calculating.
And ultimately, it works to contain Rafsanjani, but it completely dooms the presidency. Because the economic reforms are so corrupted and obstructed, they fail to deliver relief to the common people. By his second term, the macroeconomic data shows that the average household standard of living in urban areas actually decreased due to rampant inflation and skyrocketing housing costs.
Because Rafsanjani offered economic liberalization without any meaningful political liberalization. He never intended to alter the authoritarian nature of the theocratic system. He just wanted it to be wealthier.
But a growing, educated middle class was starving for tangible, positive change, for the rule of law, and for greater personal freedoms.
And this creates a massive buildup of societal frustration. The pragmatic middle path had failed.
And in politics, when the center fails, the electorate doesn't usually stay in the center. The political pendulum didn't just inch to the left, driven by a massive youth vote. It swung in an absolute landslide.
It did.
We moved from the era of the pragmatic businessman to the era of the intellectual idealist. We enter the reformist spring.
The presidency of Mohammad Khatami, who served from 1997 to 2005.
Now, Khatami is a completely different archetype. If Rafsanjani was the CEO, Khatami is the philosopher king.
Very true.
The biographical research emphasizes that while he was a religious scholar with a doctorate in Islamic sciences from Qum, he also held university degrees in Western philosophy and educational sciences.
Which is very rare for that level of cleric.
Yeah. He had a surprisingly cosmopolitan worldview for an Iranian cleric, having lived abroad and chaired the Islamic Center in Hamburg, Germany for several years.
He was intellectual, soft-spoken, and deeply interested in the compatibility of Islam with modern democratic principles. When he ran for office, he campaigned on concepts that had rarely, if ever, been uttered in the mainstream political discourse of the Islamic Republic: Islamic civil society and Islamic democracy.
He was not looking to overthrow the system.
Right.
He genuinely believed that a humane, participatory, accountable Islamic order was entirely possible.
Yes. He argued that core Islamic values actually harmonized with Western democratic values and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights.
Now, the research does note there was a major exception regarding capital punishment, which Islam and the Republic endorse.
Yeah.
But on issues of political participation, he pushed a radical new vision. He wanted the rule of law to apply to everyone. He wanted freedom of speech, and he wanted the citizens to have the institutional right to hold their government, even the clerical elements, accountable.
And early in his presidency, he took incredibly bold domestic actions to prove he meant it.
Oh, this is a heavy part of the history.
It is.
Yeah.
The research highlights a very dark, chilling period in 1998, known as the Chain Murders. Over several months, prominent dissident intellectuals, writers, and political activists were being systematically assassinated.
And these weren't random street crimes. These were highly coordinated hits.
Correct. And Khatami, facing massive public pressure and his own moral convictions, launched an investigation that led directly to the Ministry of Intelligence.
Wow. He went right at the deep state.
He did. He actually forced a public admission that rogue agents within the state's own security apparatus had committed the murders, and he initiated a reorganization of the ministry. This was a staggering, almost unthinkable challenge to the deep state security apparatus that Khamenei relied on.
He realized that to survive, the regime had to loosen its grip and allow for public participation. But Khatami knew that domestic reform was impossible if Iran remained a global pariah.
Exactly. So he applied the same philosophical lens to his foreign policy.
And this is where the geopolitical chess match gets really compelling. If you follow international relations, you are likely familiar with the political scientist Samuel Huntington's famous 1992 theory, the Clash of Civilizations, which argued that post-Cold War conflict would be driven by fundamental cultural and religious differences, essentially pitting the West against the Islamic world.
Yes, a very famous thesis.
Khatami looked at that thesis and directly publicly countered it. He proposed a dialogue of civilizations.
He took this concept to the highest international forums. He went to the United Nations and UNESCO to passionately advocate for this framework. He wanted to replace hostility with cultural exchange.
He even broke a major taboo by sitting down for an interview with American television, proposing direct people-to-people dialogue with the United States to tear down the wall of mistrust.
And in Europe, this intellectual charm offensive yielded incredible, highly tangible economic results.
The data provided the research is striking. By 2006, trailing the momentum of Khatami's policies, European Union trade with Iran had boomed to 22.5 billion euros.
Wow.
Western European embassies were reopening in Tehran. Iran was slowly, cautiously being welcomed back into the international community.
But the most crucial element of this geopolitical thaw, like the absolute linchpin of Iran's relationship with the West, was the nuclear program.
Right.
The international community, led by the U.S. and Europe, was terrified that Iran was secretly developing a nuclear weapon. Khatami wanted to prove categorically that they weren't in order to lift the looming threat of devastating sanctions. So his administration took massive, unprecedented concessions.
And the team leading those negotiations was headed by a cleric named Hassan Rouhani, a man who will become vitally important in the final chapter of our story today.
Keep that name in mind.
Rouhani and Khatami made a monumental ijtihadi compromise. In 2003, they agreed to temporarily suspend all uranium enrichment activities. Furthermore, they signed the additional protocol with the International Atomic Energy Agency, the IAEA, allowing for highly intrusive snap inspections of their nuclear facilities.
And it is vital to note that this wasn't just Iranian diplomatic posturing.
No.
The academic research provides direct corroborating evidence from the United States intelligence community itself to validate Khatami's actions. It cites a landmark 2007 U.S. National Intelligence Estimate, which is a consensus view of all 16 U.S. intelligence agencies.
And what did it conclude?
It concluded with high confidence that Tehran had indeed halted its nuclear weapons design and weaponization program in the fall of 2003, exactly when Khatami's team was negotiating.
The research notes that former U.S. Secretary of Defense Robert Gates later called this specific intelligence assessment a grievous blow to the U.S. policy of isolating Iran because it proved the Iranians were actually negotiating in good faith at that specific moment in time.
Now, it's crucial to look at this strictly through the lens of the geopolitical data provided in our source material. We are analyzing the mechanics of cause and effect here.
Right. We have to maintain strict neutrality and just report what the texts lay out.
Exactly. And according to the historical record laid out in the research, the ultimate collapse of Khatami's entire domestic reformist project was inextricably linked to his administration's inability to secure any meaningful, reciprocal geopolitical goodwill from the United States.
Let's break down the timeline of that interaction based on the text. First, during the Clinton administration, Khatami makes these grand overtures for dialogue and cultural exchange. How does the U.S. respond?
Well, the research notes that President Clinton offered what were perceived in Tehran as entirely superficial gestures, literally lifting economic sanctions on the import of Iranian pistachios, caviar, and carpets.
Meanwhile, the core U.S. policy of dual containment, which was aimed at simultaneously economically isolating both Iran and Saddam's Iraq, remained firmly in place.
But the research argues that the true breaking point for the reformist movement, the moment the geopolitical door was slammed shut, came in the aftermath of the tragic events of September 11, 2001.
Right. The Khatami government immediately and loudly denounced the al-Qaeda attacks. The historical documentation vividly describes the public reaction in Iran, a response that was virtually unparalleled anywhere else in the Middle East.
It was incredible.
Ordinary Iranian citizens poured into the streets of Tehran for spontaneous candlelight vigils. During a major soccer match, 60,000 Iranians observed a minute of silence out of respect for the American victims.
And it went far beyond just public sympathy. The geopolitical data shows actual, highly significant diplomatic cooperation.
Walk us through that.
Fast forward to the December 2001 Bonn conference in Germany. This was the international summit tasked with building the new post-Taliban government in Afghanistan.
Okay.
Iranian diplomats, specifically a highly skilled negotiator named Mohammad Javad Zarif, worked directly face-to-face and successfully with their American counterparts to construct that new Afghan government.
That's a huge level of cooperation.
It is. Zarif actively signaled a strong desire to use this cooperation as a springboard to settle their wider historical differences. The American lead negotiator actually passed this memo of cooperation up the chain to Washington.
And the historical record shows that it fell on deaf ears. Just weeks later, in January 2002, U.S. President George W. Bush delivered his State of the Union address.
And we know what happens next.
Yeah. In that speech, despite the intelligence cooperation in Afghanistan, he famously labeled Iran as a charter member of an axis of evil, alongside Iraq and North Korea.
Right. If you look at this through the lens of geopolitical game theory, it's a classic prisoner's dilemma.
Oh, that's an interesting way to frame it.
The Khatami administration, facing massive internal pressure, finally chooses to play the cooperate token, hoping to break a 20-year deadlock and secure economic release. But the United States looks at the broader board, assesses its own global strategic imperatives post 9/11, and plays the defect token.
That is precisely how the Khatami camp analyzed the situation, according to the source material. The diplomatic door wasn't just closed, it was bolted shut.
And this had immediate, devastating domestic consequences for Khatami.
It completely annihilated his political leverage at home. Supreme Leader Khamenei and the hardline conservatives had only reluctantly allowed Khatami to try his liberal, dialogue-based approach because they calculated it might bring economic relief and an end to sanctions.
Exactly. But when the U.S. responded with the axis of evil label, the hardliners turned to Khatami and essentially said, "We told you so."
Right, the jihadi worldview is correct. The West is inherently hostile and cannot be trusted. Your dialogue isn't diplomacy, it's weakness.
With zero geopolitical rewards to show for his concessions, Khatami was left completely defenseless against the conservative backlash.
And the backlash was brutal.
Khamenei and his traditional supporters in the judiciary and the IRGC began a systematic, ruthless campaign to dismantle the reformist project. They used the courts to shutter dozens of vibrant reformist newspapers.
They jailed prominent political dissidents and human rights lawyers.
They utilized the deep state security apparatus to forcefully reassert absolute control over the public sphere.
And the profound tragedy of this era, as the research clearly points out, is the massive disillusionment of the Iranian youth.
Because millions of young people had voted for Khatami in back-to-back landslides, they genuinely believed his promise of an Islamic democracy.
But when the conservatives cracked down, Khatami found himself trapped. Bound by his fundamental loyalty to the Constitution and his deference to the Supreme Leader, he was structurally incapable of protecting his own voters.
The breaking point for the youth came in the summer of 1999 during the Kui-Daneshka incident. The research highlights how peaceful student protests against the closure of a reformist newspaper were met with a brutal raid on the Tehran University dormitories by the police and plainclothes vigilantes.
The violence sparked massive nationwide riots, and in the end, thousands of students were marching in the streets, protesting against Khatami's own government, demanding his resignation because he had failed to utilize the power of the presidency to defend them.
The reformist dream had hit a solid concrete wall.
The pragmatic, business-first approach of Rafsanjani hadn't worked. The intellectual idealism of Khatami had been entirely crushed. And this sequence of failures created a massive, dangerous vacuum of public frustration.
The electorate was economically exhausted, politically cynical, and completely disillusioned with the established elites of both factions.
And in politics, when the center and the intellectual left fail simultaneously, the system is primed for a populist shock. The establishment, feeling highly vulnerable after the reformist experiment, was looking to aggressively reassert its ideological dominance.
Which means the pendulum is about to swing again.
But it doesn't just swing back to the center. Driven by the anger of the rural working class and the maneuvering of the supreme leader, it swings violently, aggressively to the far right. We enter the era of the populist hardliner, Mahmoud Ahmadinejad, who served from 2005 to 2013.
Ahmadinejad represents a fascinating, highly disruptive shift in the character of the presidency. Unlike Rafsanjani, Khatami, or his eventual successor, Rouhani, Ahmadinejad is not a cleric.
He does not wear the robes or the turban.
He was an engineer, a former provincial governor, and the mayor of Tehran. But more importantly for his political brand, he came from a poor, rural, working-class background in the Semnan province.
He possessed none of the sophisticated theological pedigree or cosmopolitan polish of the previous presidents.
But his political genius was that he knew exactly who his audience was, and he knew exactly how angry they were.
He bypassed the urban intellectuals entirely and appealed directly to the mustazafin.
Yes, the mustafin.
This is a highly potent term popularized by Khomeini during the revolution. It translates to the downtrodden or the have-nots. Ahmadinejad campaigned on an incredibly aggressive populist promise. He famously pledged to put the oil money on everyone's dinner table.
He presented himself as the pious, humble, incorruptible servant of the poor. He deliberately contrasted himself with the wealthy, corrupt Agazada elites from the Rafsanjani era and the ineffectual intellectuals of the Khatami era.
He wore cheap windbreakers instead of tailored clerical robes.
And initially, this populist image worked in perfect, synergistic tandem with Supreme Leader Khamenei's desire to consolidate the hardliners' hold on total power.
They shared a deeply suspicious, deeply hostile worldview regarding the West. Ahmadinejad immediately adopted a highly combative, deliberately provocative foreign policy, completely incinerating Khatami's dialogue of civilizations.
The geopolitical shift was whiplash-inducing. Based on the historical data, Ahmadinejad took to the global stage, specifically the UN General Assembly, and actively, repeatedly questioned the existence of the State of Israel.
The documentation explicitly states that he notoriously branded the Holocaust a Zionist ploy, engaging in outright, highly publicized Holocaust denial.
Concurrently, he tore up the nuclear agreements Khatami had made. He vastly expanded Iran's uranium enrichment program and replaced the moderate negotiators with hardline conservative ideologues.
Now, setting aside the inflammatory rhetoric, the actual geopolitical fallout of these actions was severe and immediate.
Oh, absolutely.
This uncompromising, aggressive stance completely isolated Iran internationally. It united the U.S., Europe, and even Russia and China against Tehran.
Which led directly to 3 separate rounds of punishing United Nations Security Council sanctions.
Followed by increasingly crippling unilateral financial and oil blockades from the United States and the European Union. The Iranian economy, heavily dependent on global oil markets, began to hemorrhage.
And his domestic economic management was equally chaotic. The research paints a picture of a president who believed revolutionary zeal could replace macroeconomic reality.
Right. During his presidency, global oil prices actually soared, creating a historic, unprecedented windfall for the Iranian treasury. Yet the data shows it was entirely mismanaged.
The research quotes his eventual successor, Rouhani, who claimed that Ahmadinejad's government took in a staggering $800 billion in oil revenue, but squandered $600 billion of it on importing cheap foreign goods.
Which is a textbook example of destroying your own country's economy.
Yeah.
By flooding the market with cheap imports, he completely devastated domestic manufacturing and agriculture. Millions of jobs were lost.
Furthermore, he viewed seasoned economic technocrats with deep suspicion, seeing them as holdovers from the corrupt Rafsanjani era. He bypassed the central bank entirely.
The analysis details how he intervened directly in the banking sector, forcing state-owned banks to hand out massive, low-interest, unsecured loans to preferred geographic areas and loyalist demographics to buy populist support.
And when you force a bank to give out money to people who can't pay it back, you create a massive crisis.
Exactly. The research notes this caused astronomical losses, spiked inflation into the double digits, and created a staggering non-performing loan crisis that continues to plague the Iranian financial system to this day.
And when his finance ministers and central bank governors tried to warn him about the impending disaster, what did he do? He fired them.
The records show he churned through 4 different deputy governors for foreign exchange in just a few years.
And who did he replace these fired, educated economic experts with?
Let me guess, loyalists?
Yes. The research is explicit. He systematically packed the administration, the ministries, and the provincial governorships with current and former members of the SIPA, the Revolutionary Guards, and the besieged militia.
He effectively militarized the economic and political spheres, rewarding the very forces that Khamenei relied on for regime security.
This toxic combination, soaring inflation, devastating international isolation, and heavy-handed domestic militarization created a highly combustible powder keg in Iranian society.
Which brings us to the pivotal, traumatic year of 2009.
The 2009 presidential election is a defining rupture in the history of the Islamic Republic. Ahmadinejad is running for a second term. The reformist and pragmatist camps, terrified by the economic ruin and international isolation he has caused, form a fragile coalition.
They throw their weight behind 2 candidates, Mir Hossein Mousavi, a former prime minister, and Mehdi Karoubi, a former speaker of parliament. The election takes place, the turnout is massive, and the results, well, the research states they were highly controversial and fiercely disputed.
The reformist coalition claimed decisive victory based on their own internal polling and the massive, undeniable turnout at their campaign rallies.
But what happens next completely breaks the established rules of the system.
It does. Traditionally, the supreme leader stays above the fray. He acts as the impartial patriarch, waiting for the Guardian Council to officially count and verify the votes before offering his blessing.
But in 2009, Khamenei breaks his silence early.
He steps directly into the political ring. Before the votes are even officially ratified by the required constitutional bodies, Khamenei publicly and forcefully declares Mahmoud Ahmadinejad the absolute victor.
He goes so far as to call his re-election a blessing from God.
This was a seismic, system-altering event.
By throwing his absolute theological and political weight behind a highly contested, statistically dubious result, Khamenei stripped away the illusion of republicanism. He essentially tied his own divine legitimacy directly to Mahmoud Ahmadinejad.
And the public reaction was explosive. It birthed the Green Movement.
The historical analysis describes millions of Iranians, primarily the educated, urban, post-revolution generation, pouring into the streets in massive, initially peaceful protests.
They marched in silence, holding signs asking a simple question: where is my vote?
They felt the very core of their limited democracy had been brazenly stolen. And the research points out a fascinating technological evolution here.
Oh, the use of social media?
Right. During the 1979 revolution against the Shah, Khomeini supporters organized using smuggled cassette tapes of his sermons.
Very low tech.
Yeah. But in 2009, the Green Movement protesters used Facebook, Twitter, and the BBC Persian service to completely bypass the state's media censorship.
They were capturing raw, visceral videos of the protests on their cell phones and broadcasting them to the entire world in real time.
The regime viewed this not as a political protest, but as a full-blown existential threat, a foreign-orchestrated color revolution designed to topple the theocracy.
Khamenei publicly branded the protesters as foreign conspirators. The research details the resulting, highly coordinated, bloody crackdown executed by the SIPA and the Basij.
Protesters were beaten, live ammunition was used, and dozens were killed in the streets. Hundreds of activists, journalists, and students were arrested and sent to notorious prisons like Evin.
And the leaders of the opposition, the reformist candidates, Mousavi and Karoubi, were eventually placed under strict extrajudicial house arrest,
where the research notes they remain confined to this day.
It was a brutal, uncompromising reassertion of absolute theocratic sovereignty. Khamenei risked the entire domestic stability of the nation and the legitimacy of the system in the eyes of a generation just to keep Ahmadinejad in power.
Which makes the final chapter of this specific era absolutely mind-boggling.
Oh, the falling out.
Yeah. Looking at the mechanics of this relationship, I have to ask you, if Ahmadinejad was Khamenei's chosen guy, his literal blessing from God, to the point where the supreme leader risked a revolution to protect him, Why does the historical data show that they ended up locked in a bitter, hateful feud by the end of his second term?
It is a stunning reversal of fortune, and the research dives deep into the internal dynamics of the conservative schism that caused it.
Okay, what happened?
The analytical answer is simple but profound. Ahmadinejad got too autonomous. He forgot who built the fortress he was living in. After surviving 2009, he started believing his own populist hype. He attempted to build a distinct, fiercely loyal political base that was independent of the traditional clerical establishment and, crucially, independent of the supreme leader himself.
He thought he was the actual CEO, forgetting he was just an expendable manager appointed by an all-powerful board of directors.
Exactly. And this latent tension erupted spectacularly into the open in 2011. Ahmadinejad, trying to assert total control over the executive branch, fired the Minister of Intelligence, a man named Haidar Maslahi.
Now, the mechanics of the system dictate that the Intelligence Ministry is one of the sensitive ministries that falls directly under the Supreme Leader's implicit control.
So Khamenei simply flexed his constitutional muscle, overruled the president, and reinstated Maslahi. It was a highly public, deeply humiliating slapdown for Ahmadinejad.
And Ahmadinejad's reaction is incredible. He essentially throws a political tantrum.
He really did.
The records show he boycotted his own cabinet meetings and disappeared to his home for 11 days without explanation. It was an unprecedented act of insubordination against the supreme leader.
And then there are other rumors. The research mentions persistent rumors that during this sulking period, Ahmadinejad's inner circle was frantically trying to secure a dirt file of financial corruption and political manipulation on Khamenei's own son, Mujtaba.
Mujtaba Khamenei is described in the text as a highly powerful, wealthy, hardline cleric who operates in the shadows of Beta Robari and who allegedly harbors strong ambitions to succeed his father as supreme leader.
Whether this specific dirt file actually existed or not, the absolute breakdown of trust between the two men was complete.
Khamenei had built up the coercive, violent organs of the state, the Sipa and the Basij, to crush the Green Movement, but now he had to use his immense influence over those exact same organs to systematically box in, isolate, and neutralize his own rogue president.
By the time 2013 rolls around, Ahmadinejad is constitutionally term-limited out of office, and if we assess the state of Iran at that exact moment, according to the data,
It's bad.
it's terrible. The economy is suffering from severe stagflation, the national treasury is heavily depleted, the international sanctions are tighter than ever, and the state is hemorrhaging billions of dollars to support expensive military proxy conflicts in Syria and Lebanon.
The entire jihadi-ijtihadi system was vibrating violently on the verge of fracturing.
The uncompromising jihadi approach had driven the country into a geopolitical and economic dead end. The regime desperately needed a pressure release valve.
It needed a leader who could perform a very specific, highly delicate function. Someone who possessed the impeccable revolutionary credentials to speak the language of the supreme leader, but who was also sophisticated enough to sit across a negotiating table from Western diplomats and convince them to lift the sanctions before the Iranian economy collapsed entirely.
Enter the fourth swing of the pendulum.
We transition from the unpredictable populist firebrand to the ultimate cautious insider centrist. Let's examine the era of Hassan Rouhani, who takes office in 2013.
Rouhani's political biography is the absolute definition of an establishment moderate. He is a cleric, yes, but he is also a pragmatist with a PhD in law from a university in Scotland.
Right.
He had spent decades quietly building power inside the system's most crucial institutions. He had served in the Assembly of Experts, the Expediency Council, the Parliament, and most importantly, he served for 16 years as the Secretary of the Supreme National Security Council.
And as we noted earlier, he was Iran's chief nuclear negotiator during the Khatami years.
He was a man who knew exactly where all the bodies were buried, and he knew how to walk the incredibly dangerous tightrope between the IRGC, the clerics, and the reformists.
He campaigned on a clear mandate of anti-extremism, promising to bring sanity back to governance. The research outlines his four massive interconnected priorities: stabilize the ruined macroeconomy, resolve the toxic nuclear dispute with the West to get the sanctions lifted, draft a charter for civil rights, and relax the suffocating social controls on the youth.
And here is the vital structural difference between Rouhani's attempt at diplomacy and the previous reformist Khatami's attempt.
Which was?
When Khatami tried to engage the West, Khamenei let him hang out to dry, maintaining his strategic silence. But the analytical data argues that with Rouhani, Khamenei actually, albeit cautiously, supported the foreign outreach.
Which begs the question, Why the sudden change of heart from the deeply conservative supreme leader? Why authorize negotiations with the nation he regularly calls the Great Satan?
Because above all else, Khamenei is a pragmatic survivor. It is the jihadi reflex kicking in.
He looked at the balance sheets.
He looked at the balance sheets and realized that the international sanctions brought on by Ahmadinejad's reckless provocations were no longer just an economic inconvenience. They had become an acute existential threat to the survival of the Islamic Republic itself.
The system could not fund its vast patronage networks, it could not pay the salaries of the IRGC, and it could not subsidize basic goods for the poor without access to the global financial system and oil revenue.
Khamenei needed a deal to save the state.
He gave Rouhani a leash. It came with the strict public caveat that Iran would not fully capitulate on its right to nuclear technology, and he constantly grumbled about trusting the West. But crucially, the supreme leader provided enough political top cover to protect Rouhani from the hardest-lying critics at home.
This cover allowed Rouhani and his incredibly skilled American-educated foreign minister, Javad Zarif, to achieve what many thought was impossible. They spent 2 years in grueling, highly technical, high-stakes negotiations in places like Geneva and Vienna.
And those intense negotiations culminated in July 2015 with the signing of the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, or the JCPOA, what the world commonly refers to as the Iran nuclear deal.
The mechanics of the deal were complex, but essentially, Iran agreed to drastically reduce its stockpile of enriched uranium, dismantle thousands of centrifuges, and submit to the most intense, intrusive IAEA verification regime in history.
In return, the United Nations, the European Union, and the United States lifted the crippling secondary economic sanctions in early 2016.
It was a massive, historic geopolitical victory for the pragmatist wing. Rouhani managed to patch the biggest, most dangerous hole in the sinking ship of state.
Inflation dropped, oil exports surged, and foreign investment briefly began to return. But Rouhani also had a domestic agenda.
Yes.
He had promised the voters who elected him that he would improve civil rights and political freedoms. And the research provides a really nuanced, critical look at his flagship domestic achievement, the Charter of Citizens' Rights, which he launched in 2016.
If you read the text of the charter, it sounds wonderfully progressive. It guarantees the right to a fair trial, freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, and specific protections for ethnic and religious minorities. It uses the language of a modern democracy.
But the academic analysis is careful to include the perspective of legal scholars and human rights groups who analyzed the document and labeled it as essentially toothless.
And it's toothless because of the fine print.
Right. The mechanics of the Iranian legal system render it void. The research points to Article 26 of the Charter as the perfect, glaring example. It boldly states that every citizen has the right to freedom of speech and expression.
But then it adds this massive catch-all caveat. This right shall be exercised within the limits prescribed by law.
Exactly. And who writes and interprets the law?
The unelected, conservative-dominated Guardian Council and the hardline judiciary appointed by the Supreme Leader.
If the existing draconian penal code says that criticizing the Supreme Leader or the IRGC is a crime against national security or enmity against God, then the new charter's theoretical guarantee of free speech does absolutely nothing to protect a journalist from going to prison.
Furthermore, the data notes that Rouhani entirely failed to deliver on his explicit campaign promise to secure the release of political prisoners, including the 2009 Green Movement leaders Mousavi and Karoubi from their house arrest. He simply didn't have the institutional power to override the Supreme Leader's judiciary.
So Rouhani successfully utilized his jihadi flexibility to stabilize the macroeconomy and cool the geopolitical tensions with the West. But the foundational, restrictive, authoritarian nature of the theocratic system remained entirely intact.
The fortress Khamenei built in 1989 had not moved an inch.
And this brings us to the final and perhaps most critical analytical section of our deep dive today. Because as much as Khamenei has masterfully manipulated the political pendulum, letting it swing from pragmatism to reformism to populism to moderation, there's a demographic reality ticking away underneath the surface of the country that no amount of political engineering or diplomatic maneuvering can ignore.
We have to look closely at the data regarding the post-revolutionary generation.
The statistics provided in the research are absolutely staggering, and they define the future of the nation.
Since the 1979 revolution, Iran's population has more than doubled. It now sits at over 80 million people.
And crucially, more than half of that entire population is under the age of 30.
You have to really sit with what that demographic reality means. More than half the country has absolutely no living, visceral memory of the corrupt Shah, of the fervor of the revolution or of Ayatollah Khomeini leading the masses.
Right. To this massive youth bulge, Khomeini isn't a miraculous liberator who saved them from a monarchy. He's just a stern, abstract face painted on the side of a government building. They didn't sign the social contract of 1979.
And the research notes that this new generation is highly educated and deeply connected to the globalized world through the internet. They desire what any global youth demographic desires: economic prosperity, social freedom, the ability to travel, and the freedom of artistic and personal expression.
To a vast majority of them, particularly in the sprawling urban centers like Tehran, Shiraz, and Isfahan, the strict theocratic system is increasingly viewed not as a spiritual necessity, but as a suffocating, anti-modern, bureaucratic barrier to their potential.
And they are pushing back against that barrier. It's not always through massive, dangerous street protests like in 2009. Often it is through constant, daily, relentless cultural resistance.
The research details a vibrant, unstoppable underground scene. We are talking about thriving underground rock bands, secret electronic music raves, and young people enthusiastically embracing cosmopolitan cultural identities that directly contradict the state's austere Islamic messaging.
And the regime's response to this massive cultural shift is fascinating to analyze. They haven't initiated a total Orwellian North Korean-style lockdown on all culture. They know that is impossible.
Instead, the analysis argues the system has evolved a highly sophisticated give-and-take survival mechanism.
The ruling clerical stratum, guided by the Supreme Leader, realizes that keeping a permanent, airtight lid on 40 million restless, internet-savvy youths will inevitably lead to an explosion.
So they deliberately designed the system with elasticity. The research notes that the morality police, the forces meant to strictly enforce mandatory hijab and Islamic dress codes, operate in waves.
Their enforcement has become much more sporadic and situational compared to the terrifying early days of the revolution.
The state officially bans satellite dishes, yet people are constantly finding ways around the bans to watch foreign television. And the police often look the other way until there's a specific political need for a crackdown.
The digital sphere is the perfect example of this. The state officially, legally bans platforms like Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube.
Yet the research points out that millions of Iranians use them daily via virtual private networks, or VPNs. The authorities know this is happening, but they have generally calculated that it is safer to allow this digital venting than to permanently punish the masses who access them.
The hypocrisy is baked into the system. Even the Supreme Leader and the President use Twitter to broadcast messages while maintaining the official ban for the public.
It's the ultimate hypocrisy as a highly calibrated survival tactic. And there was one specific detail in the research that absolutely blew my mind regarding how far the state is willing to go with this give-and-take strategy.
Oh, I know what you're going to say.
It's about how the clerical establishment handles the modern sexual and social realities of an unmarried youth population that can't afford to buy homes or start traditional families due to the ruined economy.
Ah, yes. The state's promotion of the practice of Psi.
Yes. Let's explain the mechanics of this because it perfectly encapsulates the jihadi-ijtihadi framework. Psi is an ancient concept in Shia Islamic jurisprudence that translates to a temporary marriage.
It is a contract where a man and a woman agree to be married for a highly specific, predetermined amount of time. It could be a year, a month, or even just a few hours.
The text explicitly states that state officials and clerics have subtly promoted this practice to the youth, even going so far as to allow these temporary marriage contracts to be arranged online.
You have to look at it from the state's structural perspective. It is a brilliant, legally and religiously sanctioned loophole. The youth are going to date and engage in relationships regardless of the law. Under strict Islamic penal codes, premarital sex is a severe crime punishable by flogging. But by utilizing Psi, the state allows the youth to engage in relationships that are suddenly, technically, completely legal.
It absorbs modern social behavior and categorizes it within the strict boundaries of Shia religious practice. It is a profound, massive concession to demographic reality, carefully dressed up as pious religious adherence.
I was trying to conceptualize how this entire system stays standing, and I think we have to move past the old cliches. It's not a pressure cooker waiting to explode. The regime under Khamenei is like a massive skyscraper built in a highly active earthquake zone using seismic-based isolation technology.
That is a much more accurate architectural metaphor.
Right. Instead of bolting the building rigidly to the bedrock, which would mean the entire structure shatters the moment the tectonic plates of the youth demographics inevitably shift, they built the foundation on these massive massive flexible rubber and steel bearings.
The psi laws, the blind eyes turned to millions of VPNs, the sporadic enforcement of social codes, those are the rubber bearings.
They allow the building to sway violently during an earthquake without the concrete foundation actually cracking.
Exactly. It doesn't fix the earthquake, but it ensures the building remains standing when the tremors stop.
And that, ultimately, is the synthesis of our deep dive into this academic research today. The Islamic Republic, under the 3-decade stewardship of Ayatollah Khomeini, is not the rigid, unthinking, brittle monolith it is so often portrayed to be in simplified geopolitical narratives.
It is a highly adaptable, fiercely pragmatic, fiercely intelligent system of survival.
It uses the presidency as a political shock absorber.
Precisely. By deliberately allowing the political pendulum of the elected government to swing from Rafsanjani's corporate pragmatism to Khatami's democratic reformism to Ahmadinejad's combative populism to Rouhani's cautious moderation, the supreme leader maintains ultimate, unyielding control at the top.
He gives the public just enough of an illusion of political change and momentum to vent their frustrations and keep them engaged in the system, while never surrendering an ounce of actual structural power.
It is the jihadi-ijtihadi framework, functioning exactly as designed. Absolute ideological rigidity at the core, endless pragmatic flexibility on the surface.
Okay, we have covered a massive amount of historical and analytical ground today.
We really have. We've gone from the chaotic, fragile 48 hours after Khomeini's death to the intricate mechanics of the nuclear deal and the hidden realities of underground culture in Tehran. But as we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave you with a final provocative thought.
Something to consider that stems directly from everything we've unpacked today about the architecture of this system.
We've spent the last hour detailing how masterfully Ayatollah Khamenei has played this complex give-and-take game over the decades. He has expertly managed these vastly different presidents, utilized strategic silence, and installed those seismic rubber bearings to keep this incredibly complex two-tiered system afloat against almost impossible internal and external odds.
But think about the timeline. This entire bespoke operating system of the Islamic Republic has only ever been managed by 2 men in modern history. Khomeini built the concrete, and Khamenei installed the flexible bearings.
The provocative question you have to wonder about looking at the data is this: what happens when the architect of this second iteration of the Republic passes away? Khamenei has been in power since 1989.
When that inevitable transition comes, can this delicate, highly personalized pendulum of power survive a third transition to a new supreme leader?
Or has this massive, digitally connected, post-revolutionary youth demographic already completely outgrown the pendulum entirely?
When that day arrives and the transfer of power begins, we will finally see if the skyscraper's foundation was strong enough to survive a new architect, or if the seismic bearings finally tear apart.
Like we said at the beginning, we naturally look for clean, binary diagnoses in politics, but the geopolitical reality is always a complex, shifting architecture. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Keep questioning the surface narratives, keep digging deeply into the historical sources, and we will see you next time.